Hello, and welcome to this important discussion on protecting Afghan human rights defenders, hosted by the Atlantic Council South Asia Center. I am Marika Theros, and I'm a senior fellow at the center. Today, brave Afghan human rights defenders face a rapidly changing and increasingly violent environment as they continue to fight and struggle for the rights of Afghans across the country. Over the last year, the world has witnessed and continues to witness a campaign of targeted killings and escalating violence against a range of human rights defenders and unlikely activists, health workers, doctors, humanitarians and deminers, human rights activists, journalists, poets, comedians, writers, and scholars, and many more. Investigations are rare and impunity is the norm. As distressing is the increasing lack of groups claiming responsibility for the attacks, although most evidence points in the direction of the Taliban and criminal gangs for hire. With the US military withdrawal nearly fully complete and the rapidly deteriorating security situation on the ground, the works of these defenders, of activists, of those working in the public interest and for the benefit of their communities has become ever more dangerous and ever more important. Yet because of the rapidity of the withdrawal, and with most attention focused on pushing a political settlement at the national level, there has been little external planning and thinking to develop a protection and prevention framework. Today, I am honored and humbled to be able to moderate this discussion with frontline defenders and experts, to hear from them about the rapidly evolving situation on the ground, to examine some of the conceptual and practical limitations on how we define, recognize, and protect activists and frontline workers, and to think through some of the options on how one might mitigate some of the risks they face while enabling them to continue their critical work at this critical time. We have with us today Ms. Horia Mossadegh, an Afghan human rights activist, political analyst, and journalist. She has faced personal threats in her work as an activist and journalist, and she is currently working with the Afghan Women's Network in Afghanistan and was previously with Amnesty International for almost 10 years. In addition, we have Ms. Samira Hamidi. She's currently a campaigner with Amnesty International, and she also works to provide security and safety training to women human rights defenders. She has extensive experience in the country working with civil society organizations, government, and UN agencies across the country. We also have with us Mr. Khalil Raufi. He is a human rights defender, campaigner, and media professional. He's an elected member of the Civil Society Joint Working Group, the founder and director of Civil Society and Human Rights Activist Network, and the founder and director of Afghanistan Youth Social and Educational Organization. Finally, I'd like to welcome Ms. Patricia Cooper. Ms. Patricia Cooper has over 45 years experience advocating for women's equality, empowerment, and education in various contexts. She is the founder of the Women's Regional Network in 2010 in Afghanistan, which is located in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. I wanted to thank you all for being with us today. And I wanted to start by asking Ms. Horia Mossadegh to give us a quick appraisal of the situation on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Marika. And also I would like to thank you, Atlantic Council, for giving us this opportunity to speak about the situation of human rights in Afghanistan. As many of you may have followed up the news in Afghanistan, unfortunately, in recent weeks, we are seeing a wave of violence and conflict that is going on all over the country. And that resulted in Taliban advancing and capturing certain towns and cities of Afghanistan, which resulted in so many other human rights violations and atrocities, including killing of civilians, torture, extrajudicial killings, and disappearances of people. In that situation, also, the situation for the human rights defenders, unfortunately, which has started deteriorating after US-Taliban peace deal was signed back in February 2020, and it had like I would say, an impact on significant increase on the number of targeted killings against human rights defenders, women human rights defenders, journalists, and civil society activists across Afghanistan. But as you also rightly mentioned, Marika, also the number of targeted attacks against other civilians and professionals such as vaccinators, medical doctors, judges, lawyers, teachers, and also university students, and also attack against other civilian objects such as universities, hospitals, places of worship have significantly increased. And what is unfortunately the current situation we are seeing is that Taliban are using brutality and violence as a way to silence people. I'm absolutely shocked that in the past 1 week, I just heard of not only about attacks and targeted killings of civilians and disappearances, but also killing of a comedian, killing of a writer, and killing of a woman who was working for Department of Women's Affairs, and killing of a woman who was simply having a shorter dress and she wasn't wearing burqa. And I think these are all showing that now even the list of the criteria for who could be a target is becoming much wide, and no one really knows who could become the next target and why they are becoming a target. And also what we are also seeing is the level of atrocities, the level of violence that the group is using to silence people. Anyone who they fear that may have a voice is quite concerning. Like even we are hearing about the other news and reports of mass killings in Molistan of Ghazni and mass killings in Spin Boldak of Kandahar. And even today I was absolutely shocked and disturbed not only by the news of the writer that was killed in Uruzgan province the night before, but also about the photos that I've seen of women and also some military people that their eyes were gouged out, and photos and footages of execution of the people, beheadings, and these are extremely disturbing. And I really, as an Afghan, I'm absolutely shocked. I'm shattered, and at the same time, I'm disgusted at the group that how they keep denying and continuing with those atrocities that are happening in broad daylight.
Thank you, Ms. Mosaddeq. I wanted to now turn to Mr. Raufi to give us a little bit more detail about about sort of the why people are being targeted and who is being targeted. So much of the conflict is framed, whether it's in ethnic terms or ideological terms, yet we're talking about non-combatants across the country. So could you please give us a little more information?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening to everyone who's watching us or who's joining us. Unfortunately, the Afghanistan war is the war of values and traditions. As we are saying always, this soft target or targeting killing goes to those who are working for the values, especially democracy and human rights values. Like those who are like, as my colleague named, Ms. Huria named, like civil society activists, human rights defenders, journalists, intellectuals, or those which they are working for to promote the rights, the basic rights of the citizen in the country. Unfortunately, the 4-decade war is like this, and this occurred because of that. And after 2001 and coming of the American and international community and the work for democracy and human rights in Afghanistan, this war separate, and this war opened a new chapter. It is because we had 5 years, dark years of the Taliban government in Afghanistan, which on that time there weren't any basic right were implemented, or the citizen had their right during their time, which I was under the control of the Taliban. I was living at that time. I see what is going on and what was happening at that time. There was just only, how can I say, there was a cable, and they always had pupil and getting pupil and banned pupil or jailing pupil, and they have a hand in every part of the lives of the citizens, like what they should wear, what they should hear, and what they should read. And it was their their values, which it doesn't change. Right now, it gets very extremist. Like after the agreement of the Taliban and the America and US, they start the target killing of, or systematic target killing of every citizens who are working with government, with civil society, who are working in for the values, our democratic values, human rights values, or basic rights of the citizens. Especially those which they are very famous in the media and very celebrated people like our colleagues. Unfortunately, we lost lots of colleagues since 2020 and now. In the Kandahar, what happened, it was very tragical. In the Kandahar in last month, they were searching those people who are participated in per day or 1 day of a workshop or a seminar. Those seminar and workshop which was to promoting of civic engagement, human rights, or democracy or democratic values. Unfortunately, we have report. It is verbal reports of our colleague from Kandahar. They are saying near to 100 activists or those who are participated in the seminar, workshop, or gathering of a civil society organization. They had been killed by the Taliban in the last month. Again, the Taliban value is just only killing. They don't know anything more than that. Just always we are saying the Hasha is a good example for that. Our colleagues, Mr. Yusuf Rashid, and other colleagues, Mr. Ibrat, and other colleagues with Ms. Frishta, and other colleagues which have been killed. And I asked in the clubhouse, I asked from the spokespersons of the Taliban, I asked, why you are killing us and our colleagues? They said, you all should be killed. You all should be killed, and you are killing, your listed should be more, and every day we should kill lots of your colleagues. This is which is every day that they are saying in the media, in the clubhouse, in their publicities, in their press release. Unfortunately, in this days, the withdrawal of the America, NATO, that made more tragedy, and no one of our colleagues are safe, because this is a very soft and very low price target killing, and it made lots of news for the Taliban. And the Taliban philosophy is only killing and making how can I say, making violence, and this is their philosophy. And for this philosophy and for their policy and strategy, the soft targeting is our colleagues are those which is ordinary citizens or civil society activists, which is they are not involved in the groups of government, or they can defend from themselves. There were sentences by our colleagues, Mrs. Hamidi, which they have written in the report, defenderless defender. We are a defenderless defender. There is no any one on the ground to defend us. And unfortunately, we are a soft target for the Taliban. Again, when we had discussion with different parts of the Taliban and groups of Taliban, like experts person, or those which is they are ordinary people and involved in their values, they are not accepting every value of has, especially the second chapter of Afghanistan constitution law, human rights. Human rights even they are not accepting the basic rights of the citizens, they are not changed, and their values not change, and their extremists get high, and every day they are killing our colleagues and those who are working for the values, or democratic values, or human rights values, are promoting these values in a traditional country, which is named Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Alfi. I'd like to pick up on a couple of things you said and ask Ms. Samira Hamidi. You had mentioned that the systematic, clearly there were killings before, but the systematic campaign of assassinations began around the signing of the US Taliban agreement and has really picked up over the last 2 years. And now with the sort of rapid withdrawal of US military forces and their allies, how has this, Ms. Samira Hamidi, how has this affected the sort of frontline, human rights workers and frontline workers? And was any planning put in place to put in effective protection mechanisms as they waited for the peace process to restart?
Thank you so much for inviting me. And I think it's very, what we are seeing in Afghanistan is very obvious that there hasn't been effective plans and mechanisms in place to respond to the needs of human rights defenders. With the start of the peace process, with the legitimacy that the United States gave to Taliban last year in February, signing an agreement, and with the ongoing acceptance of Taliban's demands, pushing the Afghan government to release 5,000 prisoners of Taliban who were accused of some of the violences and human rights violations. Actually, it gave a lot of power and a lot of recognition and legitimacy to this group. And it actually disempowered other people who are in Afghanistan and who are working for the human rights and for basically for living, for having a human way of living and for just enjoying life as any other citizen in the world will be trying to do. What this has resulted, of course, in as other colleagues said, assassinations and attacks and killings of civil society activists, human rights defenders, women human rights defenders, journalists, even political activists, for example. They have been targeted continuously for their political views. And this is one way. The other way is, of course, it has been used very smartly in terms of, silencing down voices. It has been an effort to basically spread the violence and spread the fear among the rest of the human rights community in Afghanistan. I would say that, so-and-so person was vocal and was outspoken, was part of, support system of international community. He or she was invited to many international avenues and conferences, and out of nowhere, she or he was killed. So anyone can be targeted and anyone can be killed. And I think it gave a very strong message. It gave a very strong wave of fear to the human rights defenders who work in Afghanistan and to, for example, to journalists. For years, human rights defenders have been advocating for a protection mechanism for human rights defenders in Afghanistan. For years, they have been knocking the doors of international actors, the EU delegation in Afghanistan, the UK embassy, the US embassy, the United Nations, asking for a coordinated effort to establish a protection mechanism, which is fully funded, which provides immediate protection support to human rights defenders. But these pleas and these calls have not been responded very effectively, unfortunately, up to date that I am talking. while we have been advocating for a protection mechanism, there was an openness, at least from Afghan government in 2019, to at least consider some ideas around establishment of a protection mechanism, where, you know, at the end of the day, the argument that international community used to put was that, you know, protection of citizens, including human rights defenders, is the sole responsibility of Afghan government. It falls under their mandate, it's their constitutional obligations, and they should take the, you know, initial steps. And with consulting human rights defenders, with advocating with Afghan government, with speaking to other international organizations that focus on protection of human rights defenders, we were able to provide a strategy document to Afghan government in January 2020, where we, Amnesty International and 37 human rights organizations provided a framework for a protection mechanism, how a protection mechanism should look like, what kind of a structure it should have, what kind of resources it needs, what should be the accountability mechanism, and all those things. It took a whole year for all of us to further advocate and push the Afghan government to establish this protection mechanism. Of course, in December 2020, there was a presidential decree which announced the establishment of a joint commission for for protection of human rights defenders. But with the establishment of this joint commission, the situation drastically changed in Afghanistan. There are a lot of expectations from this joint commission, and there are a lot of criticism on this joint commission. It's a 7 months old, I would say, joint commission. Doesn't have a lot of resources, doesn't have the experience. There is not much commitment from the members who are part of the Afghan government, who are deputy ministers from different ministries, and that's where, you know, I would say there's no protection mechanism, at least from Afghan government side, to respond to the needs of human rights defenders. And now the justification is more serious, that, you know, we cannot protect anyone. Look at this situation. Look at it's a complex situation. Everybody's dying. Everybody's being attacked, and that's a very upsetting situation that human rights defenders are facing. But there's another side of the story also that usually people don't talk about, and that's the international community. With the changing situation in Afghanistan, embassies shut down their visa support provision to human rights defenders and activists. And one reason was, of course, this spread of COVID-19 and the lockdown situation and all those things. But another obvious reason was, of course, closure of their offices, shrinking of their work because of security reasons. You know, even some of them might not even right now be staying in Afghanistan. Maybe they have a, I would say, an office saying this is a so-and-so embassy, but maybe it's an empty embassy. And it's very disturbing because, you know, for years, these human rights defenders have traveled across the world. They have gone to US, to Europe, to UK, to Asia, to East Asia, Central Asia, but they have returned back to their home country, hoping that they want to continue what they are doing, wanting to serve their people. And today, when they are in difficult time, these embassies are not helpful to them. These embassies have their restrictions. These embassies are asking them to go to a third country to obtain their visa. How fair is that? How fair is that for international community to use human rights defenders for 20 years, to ask them, to provoke them, and to call them to work for human rights in Afghanistan, and then suddenly turn their back and say, sorry, we are done. A withdrawal is happening. We need to leave the country. We are not safe. Our life is at risk. What about 35 million people in Afghanistan? What about these human rights activists and human rights community in Afghanistan? Well, I appreciate that Canada has stepped forward and has announced some kind of, support for human rights defenders, or recently US has made some announcement, but these are all very conditional based. You need to be registered with UNHCR. You need to be in a third country. You need to have a letter that verify you, that you have worked with United States or you have worked with Canada. These are difficult asks, in this situation. it's difficult for a lot of people to go to a third country, simply because they're not providing visa and everybody's stuck in Afghanistan. What's happening, I think, lastly, what I want to say is that Taliban has no mercy on anyone, especially on human rights community in Afghanistan. The level of hatred and the level of anger that they show to human rights community is being seen in killing of a comedian, of a writer, of course, the human rights activists, the judges, the lawyers. And I don't think they will spare anyone. And what needs to happen is, while it's important for mechanisms to support human rights defenders to move out of Afghanistan, there's a need for a lot of effort and for a lot of work to be done in Afghanistan and in some of the secure provinces like Kabul, so that human rights defenders have some kind of protection in place, because everybody immediately will not be able to do magic, get a visa, and go to a third country. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Ms. Hamidi. I wanted to, before I'll follow up with the broader group as well, and some of the types of mechanisms that are desired. But I wanted to ask, given sort of your background on supporting sort of security for women's defenders, now that we're in a sort of a different age in which you have global communications, so much documentation, has this made it more difficult to support human rights defenders than, let's say, in the past?
It has, because everybody doesn't speak English, right? All human rights defenders in Afghanistan don't have access to internet. They don't have, that contacts with their counterparts that they have been working in the past. And for me personally, it makes it difficult because I, as an Afghan working for an international organization, I know how things become easy when, a human rights defender reach out to me and I speak in Dari. Because they feel calmer. They're like, okay, there is somebody who speaks the language. I don't have to bother. And I just ask them, don't worry, just tell me what's happening. And then I do the work for them. But this is not available for them, with these other support mechanisms out there. Just think of a language, forget about everything else. It's a big barrier, I would say, that women and journalists and human rights defenders are facing and will be facing.
Thank you. I'd now like to turn to Ms. Patricia Cooper and zoom out a little bit to talk about the role of the region, given the importance the region has both in a peaceful resolution to Afghanistan, but also in contributing to further conflict. What do you think the role of the region is, specifically India and Pakistan, and are there opportunities here that can be made in contributing not only more broadly to peace and security, but in supporting and protecting human rights defenders?
Yes, thank you, Marika, and thank you to the Atlantic Council. This is an important discussion at an important, terrible time in Afghanistan. Yes, the regional perspective. Well, I'm not an expert on the region, but I do work with women in the region. And, the one thing I've learned over the last decade in this area is that India, not only is it the largest donor to Afghanistan, but according to surveys, it's also the most popular foreign country in Afghanistan. India has been a major stakeholder in peace and stability of Afghanistan, and it's been supporting a peace and reconciliation process, which is Afghan-led, Afghan-owned, and Afghan-controlled. But it lacks a common border, and it has little leverage over the actors involved in negotiations. India's policy towards Afghanistan has always been shaped by the need to prevent Pakistan from mobilizing in the region in the name of Islam. We all know that. If Afghanistan comes under the Taliban sway, experience shows there will be intensification of Islamic militancy in India's Kashmir region and possibly the rest of India. Thus, New Delhi, is against the seizure of power by violence and has taken a strong diplomatic stance against the overthrow of the current political order in Kabul, despite the fact that, as you saw in the last 2 weeks, it is open contact with the Taliban. Well, the one thing is that India does not believe that the end game is near, and they're actively working to make sure that outside powers have influence in the outcome. They keep emphasizing that Kabul's future cannot be its past. And that's something their foreign minister recently said at the Shanghai Cooperation Conference. Now, Pakistan. Well, Pakistan's stakes in Afghanistan have never been higher. As hard as it is to believe this, Pakistan too wants the Taliban to return to power through power sharing agreements that have international backing. For Pakistan, instability in Afghanistan emboldens Pakistani militants aligned with their Afghan counterparts. It deepens insecurity in Pakistan, which you may have seen the reports in the last 2 days, is that Pakistan is #1 in the world for atrocities to happen. Especially, and of course, as we all know, that the insecurity is along the tribal areas along the Afghan borders. And Pakistan, of course, received the largest number of refugees during the Civil War. And so they're concerned about yet another massive influx of Afghan refugees into Pakistan. Islamabad's been trying to persuade its Afghan allies to go for a very peaceful, negotiated political settlement. Its failure in that endeavor will, of course, not endear it at all to Washington nor to Kabul. And as we know, Pakistan did support the Afghan peace process. And they did that because they believed that it would give the Taliban a road to power with international legitimacy and economic support that comes with international legitimacy. But as we've just heard from the 3 previous speakers, we don't see the Taliban behaving in a rational way. And that's the greatest concern that's happened now, is that they're not behaving the way I think the Americans actually thought they would behave. For Pakistan, it facilitated the February 2020 agreement, and it's also been supporting the intra-Afghan peace talks going forward. But because the Taliban is gaining militarily across Afghanistan, Pakistan is losing its clout. And that's sort of amazing to see, because still the Afghan Leadership Council is still operating out of Pakistani havens. So U.S. foreign policy since the 1980s across the region of South Asia has had many, and I have to say that again, many unintended consequences in South Asia. And this latest decision by the Trump and the Biden administration could lead to a whole new set of shifts in the region. So we're not just talking about peace and security in Afghanistan, but we're talking about peace and security in the region as a whole. And Iran needs to be included in this trilateral relationship because they're all linked. All their destinies and their futures are linked together. So that leads us to where we are today. And I go back to the comments of our previous speakers. Yes, we need international intervention quickly, because unfortunately insecurity is very contagious and it's going to disable the whole region.
Thank you, Ms. Cooper. I wanted to turn back to Ms. Masadek and ask a little bit about the peace process and how it relates to current events and what a potential prevention and protection framework. And it was very obvious years ago, and actually throughout the last few years, that there's a great demand for peace amongst Afghans, but a peace that comes with the cessation of hostilities, with justice, with continued rights and so forth. And given the recent advances by the Taliban across the country, more exposure on the atrocities that are being committed now in areas under which they control. What does this mean for the peace process in Afghanistan? And how is the broader population feeling about it?
Well, at the time when peace talks between Taliban and US started, and especially with the first meeting that was made public in Moscow in February 2019, it automatically opened a window of hope and opportunity for so many Afghans. And many of us, we really saw that finally there will be an end to 40 years of war. We just saw an opportunity that we will have a peaceful life and Afghans will live after 40 years of conflict and atrocities, we will live in peace. But unfortunately, as the discussion and peace talks between Taliban and US became more serious, we realized that Afghans doesn't matter. All that is being debated at the moment is how US want to have like a somehow graceful exit from Afghanistan. And this is all that they were looking like. And the lives of Afghans didn't matter. The gains of Afghans didn't matter. And the future of Afghanistan really didn't matter. So we put all the blame on Trump administration at the time. And especially, you know, after the peace deal between Taliban and US was signed last year, you know, it frustrated so many Afghans. But again, you know, we saw that how US was imposing the provisions of its contract or agreement with the Taliban on the Afghan government, which included the release of over 5,000 Taliban prisoners, and there were hundreds of war criminals, and they were not suspected war criminals, they were convicted war criminals, they were arrested in committing acts of war crimes in the country. And again, many Afghans said, okay, if this is to have an intra-Afghan peace dialogue, and if it lead to an Afghan peace or some kind of peace and stability in the country, let it be, you know, even if it is a cup of poison, we will drink it for the sake of the people, for the sake of the peace. But unfortunately, what we saw that soon after that, Taliban were receiving this, I would say like, you know, international celebrity welcome, and they suddenly became like those celebrities that many Western diplomats and dignitaries, they were dying to rub a shoulder with them. They were so like, I would say like in demand that everyone just wanted to have a photo with them and put it somewhere and to show that they are now with the Taliban and you're meeting with the Taliban. So with that hero welcome and that, you know, celebrity treatment that Taliban have received, and also like somehow it felt like US has signed a blank check for the Taliban, and they give them the license that now they can do whatever they want to do. So this is how their confidence, not only it boosted their confidence, it took them to another level. Like as soon as the prisoners were released from Afghanistan, you can see that how security situation has significantly changed, and every hope that Afghans were having for a peaceful solution to the war, unfortunately, those hopes were tarnished to dust, and then, you know, it also sent, unfortunately, a very negative signal across the world to all the other radical groups that were fighting in different parts of the world. Like, for example, right now, many fighters inside Pakistan, they believe that, you know, because Taliban somehow, like, you know, they defeated US, so now this is the time that they can build an Islamic Emirate inside Afghanistan. And same descent, like I would say like a signal of confidence to other terrorist groups such as Al-Shabaab, such as you know, Al-Nusra, such as, you know, Boko Haram, and so many other terror groups that now you're glorifying the Taliban. You're using that if we continue with our struggle, if we continue with our fight, if we continue with our atrocities, there is no a kind of, it is not a dream to have our own state, our own territory, and our own government. And this is unfortunately what have happened. And then in regard to the peace, I think still Afghans were quite hopeful that even, you know, after the Taliban prisoners were released, after every step that they have pushed the US and the Afghan government, after every condition were met, why we are not having a peace talks? While there are so many other, I would say, excuse after excuse to delay the process. And this is now, like, many Afghans came to that conclusion. Like, you can clearly see the way that people are not only tired and exhausted from, not from the war, but from the peace that has resulted in so much violence and killings. Like, we were a victim of war, but now we are a victim of peace. We were killed in the war, but now we are killed in the peace, in the name of the peace. And this is unfortunately how the whole landscape has changed. And people just saw that how the whole debate of the peace became another opportunity for Taliban to become more vicious, more brutal, and more cruel, and to continue with their brutality. And they knew that there will not be any consequences for the group. They knew that, you know, the Taliban know that the more crime they commit, the more leverage they are going to get. And this is unfortunately happening in the past 40 years in Afghanistan. Like, we always say, like, in Afghanistan, if you kill one person, you will go to jail. If you kill 10 persons, you will go to a mental hospital. But if you kill over 100, you will become a minister, you will become a member of the parliament, or you will become a celebrity like a Taliban. And this is unfortunately what is happening in the country. And it is like the current atrocities, it is just damaging every hope that our children are having for a peaceful Afghanistan. At least my life was spent, like my entire life was spent in the war, and I have seen nothing but just the bloodshed. I was hoping that my children will see some days of peace, some days of calm, and some days of living just our life. But unfortunately, that hope has been taken away. Human Rights Commission released a report yesterday, and they said just in 3 months, less than 1 million people have been displaced. 900,000 people were internally displaced. And then we had the report from UNAMA, which increased how the death toll amongst civilians, particularly against women and children, and increased across Afghanistan. And this is, I think this is unbelievable that we are seeing that the peace unfortunately became much, much costly on our lives than the war was. And I don't know how we want to really deal with that, and how we want to continue with this.
Thank you, Ms. Masadek. It sort of really emphasizes the point that, you know, as you said, that the peace construct, unfortunately, while everyone is working towards peace construct as it was constructed has landed us here in a time where there's more violence, which is why I wanted to turn back to Samira and ask her a little bit more on the protection mechanisms. You mentioned the fact that, you know, there has been a lot of pressure for the government to establish protection mechanisms, which you see in places like Colombia, state protection mechanisms, which are often very difficult actually to implement, even in countries that have more sophisticated or like more well-developed institutions over time and less conflict. I would wanted to understand a little bit more about what Afghan activists and themselves, what types of protection mechanisms they're looking at, what types of sort of avenues. Not only, you have the, of course, the broader debate about the SIVs, expanding the categories and leaving, but also debates about how do you protect people in country, or how do you protect people in groups so that they can continue their work, so that we don't lose sort of the capacity for these defenders to work, even in the case they have to flee the country. So just a little bit to tell me what is some of the thinking right now, and where can we be most sort of some of the asks that they may have.
I think there are two sort of discussions going on when it comes to the protection of human rights defenders in Afghanistan. One is the internal mechanism, the internal protection support system that's needed. And the other one is the external one. In terms of the internal one, what's happening right now is some of the human rights organizations and some of the some of the organizations in Afghanistan that focus on protection of human rights defenders are looking into establishment of avenues where human rights defenders can move from provinces and go to safer places, and they are not stuck in war and conflict zone with their families. Another option that some of the human rights defenders are also looking into is of course, moving to neighboring countries, which is considered to be easier, but right now it's not, because even the neighboring countries like India and Uzbekistan and Tajikistan they have stopped issuing visas, and they are not giving visas, and it's very difficult. So that's another option. I think what the human rights defenders are also expecting is more planning and more preparedness from the government in terms of providing protection. I am aware of a situation from Helmand just yesterday that there is money, there is opportunity, there are people willing to support, but human rights defenders are stuck in Helmand. Nobody can take them out of the war zone. Nobody can help them, and I think that's where we need government's intervention. That's where we need Ministry of Defense. That's where we need them to put a practical plan in place where they can evacuate people, where they can help people. That's also where we need more UNAMA's support. We need more UNAMA's role. These international actors, the EU, the US, UNAMA, and others, they go and meet Taliban regularly in Qatar. At least they can convey this message that, okay, your fight is with the government, right? You're two sides of the conflict. But what about the normal, ordinary people, civilians, the human rights defenders? Why are you targeting them? Why don't you allow them to leave the conflict zone? So these are, I think, the discussions that human rights community, human rights defenders expect to happen, so that there is this protection mechanism is put in place, and they can leave the war zone. Because yesterday I was talking to a woman human rights defender, and she was crying, and she was saying, like, I don't need money. I don't need to go to US. I don't need a visa. I just want to live with my children and my husband. And how can you help? And that's a very difficult situation. That's a situation where you just put yourself in her place, your family members and her family members' place, and you just think, if you were there, what you would do. And that's where the whole challenge and the whole problem is coming. I think what's also happening is the lack of funding to support human rights defenders in Afghanistan. It has recently started and sought the attention of international community. And now, some international actors are stepping forward and they're talking about, okay, this grant and that grant about human rights, supporting human rights defenders. But again, if these systems are bureaucratic, if these grants are not accessible, if these grants take 2 weeks and 3 weeks to support a human rights defender, then once again, we are not responding to the crisis situation that human rights defenders are facing right now in Afghanistan. And that's where I think international community need to rethink about the way they are offering support to human rights defenders in Afghanistan. What also human rights defenders expect from international community, especially the US and the European countries, is that they should provide them a sort of a double entry visa, so that they have something in their passports. And if things goes really bad, they're able to buy a ticket and move out of the country. And I think few years back, that possibility was a little bit available. I remember when I was working in Afghanistan, I had opportunity of getting a year visa for US or a year visa for Schengen. But that's completely stopped now. Nobody is issuing visa for human rights defenders and activists. And I think that's a big blockage, because nobody is running away. there are many human rights defenders that I know that they are like, I need to have a guarantee that if something goes wrong, I can escape. But I'll continue until I can, because I am needed in Afghanistan. I have heard this from several of them. And it's something which the international community doesn't trust human rights defenders. They feel like everybody is running out of country and they are knocking the doors of these embassies just for the sake of getting visa and just for the sake of going to Europe and US. And they don't understand that all these activists have spent their years going to these countries and coming back to Afghanistan. So that's another thing. I think what there is at some point, when I look at the peace process, the only hope with everything that's going on in Afghanistan right now, the only hope that we see is the peace process. If this peace process works, it means that, there will be end of this bloodshed somehow, if this peace process works. And you see these international actors continuously posting, statements about pushing for the peace process, pushing for compromise, pushing for negotiations, pushing for mediation efforts and all these things. I think these are the actors that have a responsibility to speak to the Taliban, that they need to give a guarantee that, they are not going to harm the human rights community in Afghanistan. And that guarantee is the sole responsibility of embassies, is the sole responsibility of the EU, UNAMA, and United States. Because they came to Afghanistan in 2001 with slogan of protecting human rights and women's rights. Like 20 years later, they can't just, back off and say, bye-bye, we are done with it. You can't, if you're competent, you have to stand with your words and you have to put it in practice. And I think that's where a strong call is needed, and that's where there is a strong expectation from international community. Whatever Huria Jan has said in terms of, how US deal with Taliban has affected us, the people in Afghanistan, the human rights community, is a betrayal to Afghan people. Biden speaks on withdrawal of troops. Biden speaks on situation of Afghanistan. He doesn't give a single recognition to the sacrifices of Afghan people. This is a betrayal. Along with US forces, hundreds of thousands of people were killed. There are so many people who have suffered. There are so many people that are living a victim life because, they're living with trauma. And I think it's very unfair to Afghans that, after 4 decades of war and after 4 decades of seeing atrocities and bloodshed, they're just left by their own and they're just being told that, it's not our responsibility, we are done. And I put a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of international community because they came with slogan of human rights, saving human rights in Afghanistan. Nobody asked them to come. They came because 9/11 happened. Thank you.
Thank you, Samira, and thank you for reminding us about the responsibilities of the international community, but also about the responsibilities around the peace process. All peace processes in other countries have security guarantees. There's not aspirational thinking of people just guaranteeing, commitment to human rights and so forth. And so what kind of sort of guarantees might emerge or could emerge in this context has yet to be seen. I'd like to turn to Mr. Khalil Raoufi and ask a little bit, given your work working with youth and with other sort of vulnerable communities, my understanding is that human rights defenders have done a lot of work over the last 20 years with vulnerable communities. And now, given sort of the risks associated with being a human rights defender, what impact has there been on vulnerable communities? If we see over time a decrease in the work that human rights defenders are able to undertake.
Thank you. Especially thanks from Ms. Hamidi. What she said, it was exactly what I want to say, but exactly my English is not very good like her. And a special thanks from Ms. Musada, which is she said everything. It was very the reality of us. Right now, we are just thinking for the basic right of us as a defender, because we are not safe. This is our first right to life, to be life. And unfortunately, we also concerned about our regard the future of human rights in Afghanistan. But now the situation is a war situation, fighting situation. Everyone is looking or searching protection for themselves because no one is safe in the ground. As I said before, hundreds of our colleagues has been killed in the last span in Kandahar. A few hours ago, I received a message from Helmand province. Most of our colleagues escaped from Helmand province to Kandahar, and they are coming. They are in the wind to call, and they asked me for the protection. And most of them, we don't know where they are and what happened with them. Like our colleagues in Zabul, like our colleagues in Orozgan, Helmand, Badakhshan, Takhar, and 21 provinces of Afghanistan, which is right now. Exactly, this is our big concern regarding the future of values in Afghanistan, but we are on the ground through virtual or physical. When we are leaving Afghanistan or relocating Afghanistan, we will advocate for these values which we are believed to that, and we promote that during the last 20 years in the past. And exactly, it goes to the international community too. When they are sitting on the negotiation table with the Taliban, unfortunately, there is no any address, especially from negotiator of Afghanistan peace negotiation team. There is no any table or any seat for the defenders, human rights defenders, women rights defenders, for the civil society activists, for the democracy activists. Most of them are politics and political movements or from the different political parties on the table. And they are discussing and they are speaking about the dividing of power in Afghanistan. None of them are discussing about the democratic values, human rights values, and the protection of democratic and human rights values defended in Afghanistan. This is also a reality which is going on the peace negotiation and peace table. Right now, the Taliban is going very fast, and they collapsed more than 200 districts in Afghanistan. There is no any guarantee to be collapsed Afghanistan government because they start very fast and they are fighting very fast, and they're from different countries, different extremist group come and join the Taliban. Right now, from different countries, the extremist group come and join the Taliban get very strong. And in this time, responsibility goes to international community to have a concrete position regarding the situation of Afghanistan, especially the civilian casualty. Unfortunately, there is no anyone on the ground to report the exact amounts of or number of civilian casualties, because the Taliban is hiding, because they don't want to publish it, or they don't want to report this casualty in Afghanistan or civilian casualties. And the government, from the government, there's no one on the area, because most of our area is under the control of the Taliban. Right now, I received a message from the Molistan district of Ghazni. The Taliban made a violation which I can say that. It is very hard to say that. I can say that because it is very hard to say this violation. I will share with you all about this news. And this is what which is every day going with the people of us, with the activists, with the civilian of us. Again, like the past, we have released several position papers. In every international conference or gathering, or we had several position paper and press release and open letter to the international community to please and please save these values which have been we received or achieved during 20 years. It is very important to the new generation of Afghanistan, especially the democratic generation of Afghanistan. And they are, as we see in the last this protest, which is everyone getting from their house and they protest and they show their support from these values, from the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression. This is what which is every new generation believe on that. But unfortunately, the Taliban does not accept, as I said before, they are not accepting the basic right of citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rafi. I'd like to turn now to Ms. Cooper and ask, as someone who's worked for a very long time in the region, and there are many folks outside of Afghanistan who want to stand in solidarity with Afghans and who want to support Afghan human rights defenders, yet also don't know exactly what to do. What can be done, at least from from foreign human rights organizations, not maybe from governments, but what can be done both to campaign to support Afghan women and broader human rights defenders in this critical moment?
Well, with the help of Huria and Samira and all the many women leaders in Afghanistan, I would say that the women that work on human rights globally are totally distressed by what they're seeing unfold in Afghanistan. And they are coming together. They are amassing their funds together. The Women's Regional Network started a campaign, and within 3 weeks, we got about $45,000 just in individual donations. They vary from $25 up to some thousands of dollars from each personal donor. But that has to go much wider. We need a global reaction to what is happening here. There is lots of WhatsApp groups, lots of letters are being written to government authorities, to the UN Security Councils, to all the governments in the regions as well as globally, to try and beg for some kind of high-level intervention to stop what we all can see now is going to be possibly a genocide. And so that gets back to the Biden administration. And, the Biden administration was not prepared for the withdrawal of US troops. And it's a real test for American values right now. It's a real test for American laws. And I think the American citizens need to step up, and they are starting to, but they're slow, but to start to step up and hold the government accountable. The US government has the laws in place to begin to intervene. They have the Women, Peace and Security Act of 2017, which says that women are to be at the peace table, and that the conflict prevention is an integral part of that Women, Peace and Security Act. There's the Eli Wiesel Atrocity Prevention Act, which says, you're to have atrocity prevention strategies in place. There's also the Global Fragility Act, which the United States passed, and says, it is a mandate to prevent atrocities in Afghanistan. So my feeling is that the human rights organizations that you asked about, Marika, they need to come together. They need to demand from the US Congress an atrocity prevention strategy that is fully funded. The Women, Peace and Security Caucus of the House of Representatives needs to be demanding more accountability for what is unfolding right now in front of our eyes. So as we've said before, the women of Afghanistan, the minority and religious minority groups in Afghanistan cannot be left to fight the Taliban alone. In our lifetime, and in my lifetime, we've seen genocides across our planet in the last 5 decades, 6 decades. We know what it looks like, and right now we need to step up and stop it. And so that's a call that has to go out, and that's where the women's organizations that I work with are right now, trying to get high-level decision-making to happen.
Thank you. I couldn't agree with you more that for those of us outside Afghanistan, we should demand more of our countries who are very much responsible for the current predicament that we are in. Before I close, I really wanted just to ask all the panelists if they had very, very, very brief remarks they might want to make as closing remarks. So I open up the floor to those who'd like to make brief closing remarks.
Can I?
Please.
Sure. Yeah, I think as my closing remarks, I wanted to say that in the past few weeks, the level of support that the Afghan National Security Forces have received from the people from across Afghanistan is phenomenal. And this shows that so many people, they don't want to go back to the Taliban. People are simply denouncing the rule of the Taliban. And those support, it started from Herat, it went all the way to Kandahar, to Nuristan, to Uruzgan, Parwan, Badghis, Badakhshan, everywhere. And this also shows that, people don't want to live under the Taliban. People are not supporting the Taliban, whether people are in the rural or urban areas, it doesn't matter. And no one can dream or see themselves living under a government such as Taliban. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Hamidi, would you like to say anything?
Yes, yeah, very, very briefly. But I want to tell the audience, especially those in the US, to speak for Afghan people, and especially for Afghan women and for human rights community. And Afghan people are not ready for any kind of compromise with Taliban. They are a vicious group, and they don't really deserve our life, our blood, and our freedom. And we call on Americans to stand up for Afghan people the way they stood up years back. I think that's what my call would be, because this is a very critical moment of time, and the decisions that the politicians make in countries like United States doesn't necessarily mean those are the best decisions, and the consequences of some of those decisions are being seen practically in Afghanistan, and let's stop that. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I could add to that too. I just truly believe that if Americans do not uphold our commitment to democracy, human rights, and justice now, then who will? And this is, as I go back to what I said earlier, this is a test of American values, and it's a test of American laws. And the time is now to take action.
Great.
Thank you very much from councils. Finally, I would like to ask from international community to support and protect the values, and especially democratic values and human rights values, which we achieved during the last 20 years. Also those who are fight for these values, like human rights defenders, civil society activists, And in this day, we need for the protection and relocation because no area is safe in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you. I would just wanted to thank you all now for joining us today on such a difficult topic. And as we've heard from all our panel of experts, human rights defenders are really facing an existential crisis in the country at this moment. And alongside the increasing violence and Taliban offensive, though it is heartening to hear that we are also witnessing mass mobilization across the country, opposing the violence and demanding their dignity. The situation remains difficult. The context is always evolving, and there is much that can be done to support the Afghan people, activists, and human rights defenders as they continue to struggle for peace and justice in their country. But I just wanted to thank the panelists for one last time for joining us, and I'm sure we'll have many more discussions, and I hope to have many more discussions in the coming future, but also to thank the Atlantic Council South Asia Center for hosting this timely event. Thank you.